Guys, it's Miss War Cow, and this is a video for today, Monday, January 29th, and it is wrapping up biodiversity. We are skipping ahead a few units, going to the end of Unit 9, which is the human impacts on biodiversity. We're going to be looking at 9.8, 9.9, and 9.10. So these are kind of the big ideas of each of those topics. 9.8 looks at invasive species and strategies how to control them. 9.9 is talking about species that are endangered and strategies to fix that or combat that problem. And then 9.10, the big one, looking at how human activities affect biodiversity. We're going to be looking and listing and naming all these human activities. Some of them we'll be getting into a little bit more detail than others. Others we're going to talk more about as we go through this course. Okay? So let's start with 9.10, the main human activities that you need to know. So you do need to commit this acronym to memory. It's HIPCO, like a hippo, but with a C. All right. And you need to know what each of these letters stand for. So we're going to be looking at habitat destruction, loss, degradation, and fragmentation, invasive species. Those will be the two main focuses of today. And then they also have population growth and resource use, pollution, climate change, and overexploitation. Those we will cover in more detail as we go through the remaining units. So let's take a look at habitat loss and fragmentation first, as this is indeed the number one threat to biodiversity. It is the number one reason why things are going extinct. So as we stated before, there have been 5 mass extinction events in Earth's history. We are in the midst of a 6th one right now, where things are going extinct faster than they naturally would. And most of that is due to the fact that things are losing their habitats, either to human activities like urban sprawl. We are driving things out of their natural habitats for agriculture. We are changing their habitats so that we can obtain some sort of provisioning resource like lumber or other materials, or climate change, which we'll talk about a little bit on down the road. All right. So habitat loss and fragmentation can literally affect any living thing, but it's especially going to affect those organisms that need either very specific habitats. So they live in a very, very small range of tolerance. They have a very specific set of factors that they require in order to survive, grow, and thrive and reproduce, or organisms that need large territories. All right. Fragmentation is when habitats are broken. When habitats are broken into non-connected pieces. So just what it sounds like. All right, so if we take a look, I'm just going to scroll back for a second. If we take a look at this picture, so this is the gray is the former distribution of Asian elephants, I believe, or Indian elephants. And the kind of red dots or pink or whatever color that is their current distribution. All right. And what we can see is that these dots, you don't have a connection between these, whereas before you did. And that is what fragmentation does. Now, why fragmentation is a big problem is that it's going to impact an organism's ability to breed. If they require really large territories and they have to run into one another in order to breed, to hunt. Some of these organisms need lots and lots of connected space because they are at those higher ends of the food chain. So remember the rule of 10%. A lot of that energy gets lost along the way. So to support one predator, you need a whole bunch of prey, and their ability to migrate. So here's a kind of visual representation of fragmentation versus habitat loss. So here's our original habitats. We have these 4 polygon shapes. All right. In habitat loss, you are decreasing the amount of habitat, which is kind of straightforward. So in this one, all the shapes are still there, but they're just a little bit smaller. In this one, 2 of the shapes are still there, this one and this one, but these other 2 have been removed. Okay, maybe that was because we built something there, we changed it into farmland, something of that nature. But with fragmentation, I'm cutting these shapes or cutting these habitats into smaller pieces. So now they're not as useful for these organisms. So let's say if we take a look at this shape, all right, this little like kind of upside down L shape in this corner. And we look here, this L shape is still kind of there, but we took out this big chunk. So any organisms that are still in this area now don't have enough space. They don't have a way to access the rest of this habitat, this territory. All right, our next threat to biodiversity is invasive species. And again, this should be a nice little review from biology and or earth science. So invasive species are alien species or non-native species. They introduced to a new area, generally through human intervention. We either bring them somewhere on purpose because we want to use them for some economic benefit. We think they're pretty, whatever. Or we might accidentally bring them somewhere by accident. They get into goods that we're importing and exporting. So that's how they're going to end up moving. They don't technically become invasive until they start outcompeting native species. So you can bring in non-native species that might not end up being a problem. Like, for example, ladybugs. Ladybugs are not invasive technically because they fit well into this ecosystem in North America. They're originally from Asia. But the reason invasive species outcompete native species is usually because they don't have natural predators in their new environment, in their new habitat. There's nothing suppressing or controlling their population. All right, they are often generalists, so they are going to adapt really well to new environments, even if it's slightly different than their natural or home environment. And they are what's called R-selected species. So I know we haven't talked about that yet, but that's going to be like the first thing we talk about next unit. So let's go ahead and preview that. Basically, an R-selected species is one that their reproductive strategy is have as many offsprings as possible. They will have thousands and thousands and thousands of babies in the hope that a few of them survive. But in their new habitats, they have thousands and thousands and thousands of babies, but most of them survive. So because of this, their population explodes, grows out of control. They're now going to use more resources, outcompete those native species. The textbook hallmark classic poster child of this is the good old cane toad. So the cane toads are native to Central and South America. They just kind of look like these little frogs. They're kind of cute. And they are R-selected species. They can lay between 8 to 30,000 eggs at a time. And the reason they lay that many is because in their native habitat, where they have natural predators, less than 0.5% of those offspring survive. So you need to have that many offspring to keep your population where you want it to. They have this nifty little adaptation. If you see here, this is a cane toad in Belize. That's really cool to see. You see this little triangle thingy here? That is where it produces a toxin, a poison. You can see the same one here. This cane toad is not in South America or Central America anymore. He or she or them, I don't know what their gender is in Australia. And they were imported to Australia back in the 30s as a way they wanted to use cane toads to reduce agricultural pests, but it ended up backfiring. There's nothing in Australia that can really eat these. Like, there's just no natural predators there. Things will try to eat them, but because they're not adapted to this toxin basically kills off any predators. Most of these cane toads are able to survive longer than they would in their natural habitats. So we started off with like 100 cane toads back in the 1930s, and now there are like literally hundreds of millions of them. And they are causing a great big fuss and a great big problem because they are causing a decrease in biodiversity. They're using all the resources. The native species don't have those. Their populations start to plummet. Okay. But it's not just biodiversity we're concerned about. Invasive species are very costly to people. They cause a lot of problems for us. They can destroy crops. They can damage infrastructure. So another kind of poster child for invasive species are zebra mussels, which are these little mollusks that attach to things. They ended up in the Great Lakes through the canal systems. And what we see is that they will actually like destroy infrastructure at like power plants where you need to take in water in order for them to function. These zebra mussels will literally clog them up. Invasive species cost a lot to remove. It's very difficult to remove them, and they can cause a decrease in property values. All right, you don't want to necessarily be living around them because they cause problems. Okay, we're going to skip through, just take a quick look at these, just know what they are for right now. We will talk more about them later. We're going to be talking about population growth next unit. All right, we know, even if you have not taken earth science or any of that, you probably know the population is growing. There's more people on Earth today than there were yesterday. There will be more people tomorrow than there are today. All right, and as we add more people, all those people require things in order to live. That is their human rights. People need water, food, shelter, things of that nature. All right. And it's very easy to think that, oh, well, this is probably only an issue in like places where your populations are growing really fast. All right. And to a certain extent, like they are going to have to think about, you know, where are they going to be able to obtain all these resources from? How are you going to be able to feed a super quickly growing population? But we also need to think about the societies that are industrialized already. Typically, their populations aren't growing as fast, like in the United States or like most of Europe, places like that. But each person in those societies tends to use a greater share of resources. So they have just as big of an impact, if not a larger impact on the environment. All right, but more on that in Unit 3. Pollution, more on this towards the later units, so 5, 6, and 7. We're going to be looking at air, water, soil, even things like light and noise pollution. That affects more people than anything. But we know that pollution is a result of human activity. We're going to be talking about specific types of pollution like nutrient pollution, persistent organic pollution, which are the ones that build up in food chains and can cause a decrease in biodiversity that way. And then how pollutants can infect other abiotic factors. But more on that later. Just know pollution's bad. But you already knew that. All right, climate change. Let's talk about this for just a second. All right, so climate change, we know that humans play a role in this in that we add a substantial amount of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere that would not naturally be there otherwise. We do this primarily through the combustion of fossil fuels and deforestation. Because of that, there's more carbon dioxide. Because there's more carbon dioxide, the temperatures increase, and that changes your biome classification. We remember that biomes are classified by their climate conditions. So if something gets warmer, it's not the same thing anymore. Grasslands become more like deserts. Forests become more like grasslands, so on and so forth. So changing habitats impacts genetic diversity as well as species diversity. Not only are you going to lose groups of things, all right, because their habitats are lost, like we said earlier, but changing habitats can make it more difficult for organisms to find mates that are not genetically related to them or similar to themselves. So, for example, polar bears are great examples of this. All right, they require ice sheets in order to find one another. All right, that's how they primarily travel, is by traversing those. It's also how they hunt. All right, so because this habitat is changing as a result of climate change, they are having a harder and harder time finding non-related individuals to mate with. They end up inbreeding a little bit more than they naturally would. Now you have lower genetic diversity, and we remember that where you have lower genetic diversity, you have populations that are less resilient against environmental change. It's harder for them to deal with the changes that are inevitably going to happen. All right. Something else I want to mention about climate change is this idea here of positive feedback loops. I feel like we've kind of looked at this a tiny bit, but I just want to make sure I explicitly talk about this. With climate change, we have something called positive and negative feedback loops. And what I want to specifically look at with this is the positive feedback loop of climate change and increasing temperatures. So what a positive feedback loop is basically is that a change happens, which causes some other thing to occur, which then causes that change to happen even more. So it's like a self-perpetuating cycle. So here with, especially in Arctic or tundra biomes, okay, we have an increase in temperature. Okay, that's the change. That's what we started with. Because of this increase in temperature, snow melts. Okay, that checks out. That's reasonable. All right. But snow and ice have something called the albedo effect. So alba is Latin for white. And we know that lighter color things reflect light as opposed to absorb it. All right. So when the snow and ice melts, instead of having this light colored surface that heat and energy is going to bounce off of, light's going to bounce off of, you have this darker surface revealed, which is the ocean water. And because it's darker, it's going to increase the absorption of that light and energy, which is then going to cause an increase in temperature. And so now the cycle starts all over again. All right, so a positive feedback loop is when something happens that causes a change or causes a series of events that allows that thing to continue. Okay. So this is a question. You are welcome to pause the video here if you, pause the video here if you like, and give yourself a little practice on this. As the amount of sea ice has decreased, larger expanses of Arctic Ocean are completely free of sea ice for several weeks. Each summer, ring seals, which are the preferred prey of polar bears, come to the holes in sea ice to breathe. All right, so we would want to be able to describe how the change in sea ice habitats affects the polar bear's ability to hunt and feed. So remember, describe, we had to give some characteristics, give some detail. We can't just be like, oh, it'll make them be better hunters or worse hunters or whatever. It will negatively affect them, positively affect them. You would have to say how. So if you want to take a look at that, you are absolutely welcome to. All right. So what I would expect from this answer, I would expect you to say something along the lines of, decreased sea ice will negatively impact a polar bear's ability to hunt because there's less ice. The ring seals, can pop up out of the water and breathe without being near the polar bears. It'll be harder for the polar bears to hunt down the seals because the ice is gone. You could say something along the lines of the polar bears will have to use more energy to swim between ice, which means there's less energy for them to hunt, something along those lines. Okay. So let's talk about the final letter in the HIPCO acronym, and that is overharvesting or overexploitation. Again, we're going to talk about more of this in Unit 5 with this idea called tragedy of the commons. Just kind of like a cornerstone of this class. But basically, it's pretty straightforward. As human demand increases, we take out more things. And if we take out more things, if we take out things faster than they can replace themselves, you eventually run out. It's like a savings account. So the fine historical example of this was the dodo bird, which we remember was native to, oh gosh, I'm trying to remember the island and I can't, but it was native to one island off the coast of Africa. It was a large flightless bird. It had no natural predators on that island. So when humans like kind of ran into them for the first time, like these dodo birds had no natural fear of them because they didn't recognize them as predators. So they were really easy to hunt. And like within a few, I don't even know how long, but within a relatively short period of time, they had completely gone extinct. All right, and this still continues to this day with overfishing, clear cutting, which we'll look at more at in Unit 5. All right, speaking of using organisms for our benefits, sometimes we cause a negative consequence even when we're not dealing with organisms that are in, say, like ecosystems, like looking at domesticated animals. So domestication's been a super important process, obviously, like throughout human history. We would not be who we are without domestication. But it's had this kind of negative side effect, all right, that we're now dealing with. So when we domesticate animals, typically what we will do is we will artificially select. Okay, so we'll purposely breed certain individuals in order to get them to have a trait that we want them to have. So for example, these lovely little Holstein cows, these are the black and white cows. These are usually dairy cows. They're not meat cattle. So if you look at a Holstein cow, you might say, oh, you know, it looks kind of on the skinny side. Like why is it so skinny? That's its body shape. That's a trait that it has. And it's because it uses most of its energy not towards building like body tissue, but towards dairy production, towards making milk. That's as opposed to like an Angus cow, which is this one down here. Okay. The trait that's been selected for is growth, is building body tissues, building muscle, building things like that, so that you get more meat out of them, which makes sense. All right. So this has been really beneficial to us because, you know, we can get the maximum amount of resources, but what we have essentially done is we have created very, very, very shallow gene pools. We've decreased genetic diversity. So as habitats start to change, okay, as the world around us changes because of climate change and things like that, these animals don't respond very well to that. They don't respond very well to changes in their environment as a result of their lower genetic diversity. So those are some of the ways that we have negatively impacted. That covers pretty much all of 9.10 as well as 9.8 because we talked about invasive species. Now let's talk about 9.9, which are endangered species. So what happens as a result of all this human activity and shenanigans and changing environments? What do we ultimately end up with? And what we ultimately end up with are endangered species. And that is any species that is at serious risk for extinction. Now, what I need you to know, friends, is the typical characteristics. Okay, who is more likely? Because some species are very unlikely to become endangered. Like rats, probably not going to become endangered anytime soon. Cockroaches, not likely to become endangered anytime soon because they don't meet these characteristics. All right, typical characteristics. Specialists. Specialists are extremely prone to becoming endangered because they have very specific habitat requirements and very specific diet requirements. So if that changes, they can't deal with that. They're not generalist. Having a small population size to begin with. All right, remember, with the rule of 10%, all right, you can't have 1,000,000 billion apex predators. There's not enough energy at the bottom of the pyramid to support that. Having a limited geographic distribution, being of a large size, again, same thing with that rule of 10%. You're going to need a lot of food to support that. Not a lot of food to have. Or having some economic and or commercial value. So why do things become endangered? Losing habitat is going to be your number one reason, but also poaching, competition from invasive species, and climate change, which again ties directly back into losing habitat. So let's take a look at a fine example of this, the snow leopard. So I think I've already mentioned snow leopards in class, but I'll talk about them again because I like them. All right, snow leopards are an apex predator in tundra biomes. Remember, tundras have very low net primary productivity. There's not a ton of photosynthesis going on because it's super cold and super dry. All right, so you don't have a ton of producers, which means you have very few primary consumers. Snow leopards are generally secondary consumers. They're going to eat things like mountain goats and sheep and things of that nature. All right. You already have a really small population. You can't have a million billion snow leopards. There's not enough mountain goats to support them because there's not enough photosynthesis happening to support those mountain goats. They have a very limited distribution. So this is their current range. So like Nepal, parts of China, Kazakhstan, some parts of Mongolia, and maybe even Russia to a certain extent, but very small. Each of these individuals, okay, these are not like super great big cats. They're not like big cats like tigers and lions. They're not like 400 or 500 pounds. They're like maybe 100 pounds at most, I think, like 120 pounds maybe. But each individual is going to have a territory that could be several hundreds of square miles. So even though this looks like a lot of space, it's really not, given that each one of these is going to need a tremendous amount of space to hunt. All right. They have economic and commercial value in that they have been poached for these beautiful, beautiful pelts of theirs. Or because farmers as humans, populations grow, we spread out, we have to find spaces to live and work and whatnot. These snow leopards can be a predator to domesticated livestock. All right. In which case farmers may feel compelled to hunt them so that they do not disturb the livestock, which again makes that's very reasonable. It's a reasonable thing. But because you have such a small population, poaching one or two of these has a massive impact on your genetic diversity. It's a massive, massive impact overall. So let's take a look at who is endangered, who's more likely to be endangered. So what this is called the IUCN Red List. It's basically the international list. These different colors represent critically endangered, threatened, vulnerable. I don't need you to remember the difference between those. But what can we tell from this list? Who is most in trouble? Okay, I'm going to assume you said amphibians. Good job. Well done. All right, we can see that up to 30% or almost 30% of all known amphibian species are either endangered, threatened, or vulnerable, which means they are inching their way towards extinction unless something changes. So what can we do? All right, we have talked a lot about problems. I just spent half an hour talking about how people mess things up. So how do we make things better? Because ultimately that's what we want. So one of the things that we can do is we can pass legislation. We can make things legal and or illegal. In this class, there are 10 pieces of legislation that you have to memorize. Not memorize what they say exactly, but what they do. Okay, and this first one is the Endangered Species Act, which was passed in 1973 in the United States, and it basically protects organisms that are endangered or threatened. It basically says that federal agencies can't do things that might jeopardize them. It forbids agencies or citizens from taking endangered species or animals out of their environment without a permit. And this doesn't just include the whole animal. This can also include parts. One of the kind of poster childs for the success of the Endangered Species Act is the bald eagle. All right, so bald eagles were critically endangered in the early part of the 20th century. Most of that was because, they could have been hunted, but they were mainly affected by this pesticide called DDT, which we'll talk about in Unit 8, I think. So they were listed as endangered in 1978. 5 years after this act was passed, DDT was banned right around the same time. And with bald eagles, not only are you not allowed to hunt them, obviously, you're not allowed to harm them, you're not allowed to harass them, you're not allowed to mess with their nest. You can't even be in possession of a feather from them because it's assumed, well, you might have harmed an animal in order to obtain that. So you cannot have that in your possession legally unless you have gone through like a permit process. And what we can see is from 1973 up to modern times, the number of bald eagle pairs has skyrocketed. They are well on their way to recovery, and that is an awesome thing. So it worked. Yay, we did it. Good job. Another piece of legislation that you are needing to know, this is an international agreement. This Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, also 1973. It's called CITES. You can just call it CITES. But basically what it does, it just controls, it has a list of species whose international trade is controlled. So if something is endangered or threatened, it goes on this list. And now there is like a specific set of requirements and varying degrees of protection depending on how endangered or how threatened that species is. All right, so this is international. All right, some solutions to invasive species. All right, again, legislation, and this has been passed in a variety of ways, both at like federal, state, local levels, basically prohibiting the transport of invasive species. You can't bring them in and out. Inspecting imported goods so that you ensure that those things don't accidentally make it into new habitats unknowingly. Another potential solution is introducing a natural predator. However, something to be mindful of, these could become invasive as well. All right, just like the cane toad was originally brought in to be a natural predator, and then they became invasive. That can happen as well. So that is something you want to like be mindful of. And then lastly, physical removal. There are a lot of places where people will get paid money. You get paid money for going out, finding these invasive species, taking them out, turning them over. When I was in Belize, like one of the excursions that like you could do at the hotel that I stayed at, they literally had like fishing trips where like you would go hunt lionfish specifically. And you like the goal was just kill as many lionfish as you possibly can because they're extremely invasive in the Caribbean. This guy, Fishing Garrett on TikTok, he's the guy that goes through the Everglades barefoot, and he says yoink a lot. Like that's his thing. I don't know how he's not been like seriously injured by an alligator, but his goal is to like remove Burmese pythons, which is awesome. That's great. We love that. Obviously anything like taking any individual out, any individual invasive species, that does help a little bit, but it is really, really hard to completely solve your problem that way. So ultimately, what you want to focus on is not removing the invasive species, but preventing them from being a problem in the first place, which is where these first two solutions are going to come into play. It's a lot easier to prevent a problem than it is to fix it. Okay. And then finally, our final solution goes back to that OG habitat fragmentation. All right. So habitat loss happens for a variety of reasons. So that's going to have a variety of solutions. But we know habitat fragmentation is a problem because it breaks apart. It breaks apart habitats so things can't move between. All right. A habitat corridor is going to be something that people build and construct that allows for safe migration of those organisms in between those now fragmented habitats. So it reconnects them, just like a corridor in a house connects rooms. All right, so here we have a fine example. These habitats were fragmented by this highway. So this habitat corridor is going to allow for the safe passage of not just predators, but also prey, large animals, small animals. All right, they're going to be able to cross more safely so they can utilize the rest of this habitat. We'll talk more about We'll talk more about sustainable land use practices in terms of like agriculture, urbanization, when we get to Unit 5, okay? So, now that was a lot of information. A lot of it was probably review though, which is awesome. You have a tiny, tiny assignment on Canvas today. Make sure that you are studying for your test tomorrow. You're going to do your best, and I will see you then.